History is not always written in books. Sometimes it is written in concrete, barbed wire, and silence. For nearly 30 years, a wall stood in the heart of Europe. It did not just divide a city. It divided families, futures, and freedom itself. On one side, people lived under watch, control, and fear. On the other, they lived with freedom, but always in the shadow of concrete and guns. This wall was called the Berlin Wall. And in 1989, the world watched as it fell. But the fall of the Berlin Wall was not just one night of celebration. It was the result of decades of tension, quiet resistance, political mistakes, human courage, and ordinary people refusing to accept fear as normal. It was a story of escape and sacrifice, of protest and patience, of mistakes at the top and bravery at the bottom. In this video on Historyteller YT, you are not just going to hear dates and events. You're going to step into the lives of people who lived behind the wall, those who guarded it, those who escaped it, and those who finally walked through it when history changed forever. This is the story of the Cold War's most powerful symbol. This is the story of division and reunification. This is the story of how a wall fell and how the world changed with it. Stay with us. In 1945, Europe stood in silence after 6 years of devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, economies had collapsed, and tens of millions of people were dead or displaced. Germany, once the industrial heart of Europe, was completely defeated. Its government had collapsed, its military destroyed, and its moral authority shattered by the crimes of the Nazi regime. The question facing the victorious Allied powers was not only how to rebuild Europe, but how to prevent such destruction from ever happening again. Germany became the central problem. The Allies agreed that it could never again be allowed to threaten the world. But they did not agree on how to achieve that goal. The United States and its Western allies believed Germany should be rebuilt economically and politically, integrated into a democratic system that would stabilize Europe. The Soviet Union, having suffered enormous losses at the hands of Nazi Germany, viewed security very differently. It wanted strong control, heavy reparations, and a buffer zone between itself and the West. As a result, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, was also divided, even though it sat deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone. At first, this division was supposed to be temporary. There was still hope that Germany might one day be reunified. But as tensions between the former allies grew, it became clear that Germany was turning into the front line of a much larger global conflict. By the late 1940s, cooperation between the Allies had collapsed. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as superpowers with fundamentally opposing worldviews. The United States promoted capitalism, political freedom, and democratic institutions. The Soviet Union promoted communism, centralized control, and a one-party state. Each side believed its system was not only better, but necessary for global stability. This ideological conflict became known as the Cold War because it rarely involved direct fighting between the two superpowers. Instead, it played out through political pressure, economic competition, military alliances, and proxy wars. Europe, and especially Germany, became the most visible stage for this struggle. In 1949, the division of Germany became permanent. The Western zones were united into the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. It aligned with the United States and Western Europe. In response, the Soviet-controlled zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, a communist state firmly tied to Moscow. Berlin was now a divided city in a divided country, symbolizing the growing split between East and West. This division was not only political, it quickly became personal. Families were separated, travel became restricted, and two very different societies began to develop on opposite sides of the same nation. While West Germany received economic aid through the Marshall Plan and began to prosper, East Germany faced shortages, political repression, and strict state control. Berlin was unique and dangerous. It was a Western-controlled island surrounded by communist East Germany. For many East Germans, Berlin became a gateway to freedom. Until the early 1960s, it was still possible to cross from East to West Berlin, and millions did. There were students, workers, professionals, and families seeking better lives. This mass migration created a crisis for East Germany, draining it of skilled labor and undermining its legitimacy. The East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, claimed that this movement threatened the survival of socialism. In reality, it revealed a simple truth. Many people were voting with their feet. The pressure mounted year after year. Western leaders insisted on maintaining access to Berlin, while Soviet leaders viewed the city as a constant security risk. By the early 1960s, the situation had become unsustainable. Tensions rose, tanks faced each other at checkpoints, and the possibility of war loomed. Behind closed doors, East German leaders pushed for drastic action. They argued that only a physical barrier could stop the flow of people and stabilize their state. That decision would soon reshape Berlin, Germany, and the world. By the end of the 1950s, East Germany faced a silent but devastating crisis. It was not a war, not a rebellion, and not an invasion. It was the steady disappearance of its own people. Since the founding of the German Democratic Republic in 1949, more than 2.5 million East Germans had left for the West. They were young workers, doctors, engineers, teachers, and students. Each person who left weakened the economy and exposed the failure of the socialist promise. The East German government officially claimed that socialism was superior to capitalism, that workers lived better lives under communist rule. Yet the reality was impossible to hide. Wages were lower, consumer goods were scarce, housing was poor, and political freedom did not exist. The secret police, known as the Stasi, monitored citizens constantly. Criticism of the state could lead to job loss, imprisonment, or worse. For many East Germans, the future felt closed. Berlin became the main escape route. Unlike the heavily guarded borders between East and West Germany, Berlin still allowed relatively easy movement. People could take a subway or walk across streets that technically cross from one political system into another. West Berlin represented opportunity, safety, and freedom. Once there, refugees were quickly transported to West Germany. This mass exodus embarrassed East German leaders and terrified the Soviet Union. If people were leaving in such large numbers, what did that say about socialism? Worse, it threatened the survival of the East German state itself. Factories struggled to operate. Hospitals lost trained staff. Entire professions were hollowed out. Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, insisted publicly that no wall would be built. In private, he and his advisors argued the opposite. They believed drastic action was necessary. Without sealing Berlin, East Germany would collapse from within. The Cold War had created a situation where a government felt forced to imprison its own population to survive. On the night of August 12, 1961, while Berlin slept, the East German government launched a secret operation. Thousands of soldiers, police officers, and construction workers were mobilized. Trucks rolled quietly through the streets. By early morning, barbed wire cut through roads, sidewalks, and neighborhoods. Subway lines were severed. Streets ended abruptly in coils of wire and armed guards. Berliners woke up to a shock that was immediate and personal. Families found themselves separated overnight. A street that once connected neighbors now marked a border between two worlds. Workers could no longer reach their jobs. Children could not reach their schools. No vote had been held. No warning had been given. Within days, the barbed wire was replaced with concrete. The temporary barrier hardened into a permanent structure. The Berlin Wall was not a single wall, but a complex system. It included concrete slabs, watchtowers, guard dogs, floodlights, and a wide death strip designed to expose anyone who tried to escape. Orders were clear. Border guards were expected to shoot escapees. The East German government called the wall an anti-fascist protective barrier. They claimed it was built to protect socialism from Western aggression. The West called it what it clearly was, a prison wall. U.S. President John F. Kennedy condemned the division, but avoided military confrontation. Neither side wanted a war over Berlin. For ordinary people, ideology mattered less than loss. Parents waved to children across the wall. Couples shouted conversations through concrete gaps before they were sealed. Churches suddenly stood isolated on one side, their congregations trapped on the other. A city that had survived bombings and occupation was now torn apart by politics. Despite the danger, people immediately tried to escape. Some jumped from apartment windows facing West Berlin before the buildings were sealed. Others ran across unfinished sections of the wall. A few succeeded. Many did not. One of the earliest victims was Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old bricklayer who was shot while trying to climb the wall in 1962. He bled to death in full view of the Western press, while guards refused to help him. His death shocked the world. Images of his body lying helpless near the wall became symbols of the cruelty of division. Yet the wall remained. The East German government tightened controls, perfected its security systems, and increased punishment for escape attempts. Those caught alive faced prison sentences. Their families were often harassed or punished as well. The wall changed daily life in subtle ways too. People learned to avoid windows near the border. Streets grew quiet. Fear became routine. The Stasi expanded its network of informants, ensuring that even private conversations were never truly private. Trust eroded between neighbors, friends, and even family members. Still, resistance never fully disappeared. Some resisted quietly, through art, music, and private defiance. Others planned elaborate tunnel escapes beneath the wall. Each attempt reminded the authorities that concrete could not erase human desire for freedom. The Berlin Wall had risen, but it had not ended the story. It had only begun a new chapter, one defined by endurance, separation, and the slow buildup of pressure that no wall could hold forever. Life in East Germany after the construction of the Berlin Wall settled into a strange mixture of routine and restriction. The shock of sudden division slowly turned into a daily reality shaped by control, fear, and adaptation. The government promised stability and equality, but that promise came at the cost of personal freedom. The state was present in nearly every aspect of life, from education and employment to travel and private conversation. The Socialist Unity Party ruled without opposition. Elections existed, but results were predetermined. From a young age, children were taught loyalty to the state through school programs and youth organizations. Education emphasized socialist ideology and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Career opportunities often depended more on political reliability than talent or ambition. Those who questioned authority quietly found doors closed to them. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, became one of the most extensive surveillance systems in history. It relied not only on officers, but on ordinary citizens who were pressured or persuaded to inform on others. Friends reported friends. Spouses reported spouses. The fear of being watched shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. People learned to speak carefully, especially at home, knowing walls might have ears. Material life was modest. Basic needs such as housing, healthcare, and education were guaranteed, but shortages were common. Waiting years for a car was normal. Consumer goods were limited and often outdated. Travel to the West was nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. For many, the wall was not just concrete. It was a constant reminder that the state did not trust its own people. Yet life was not only misery. People formed strong social bonds. Neighborhoods relied on one another. Cultural life continued through theater, music, and sports, often carrying subtle criticism beneath the surface. East Germans learned to survive within the system, even as many quietly dreamed of something more. West Berlin existed in a unique and often tense position. It was a democratic enclave completely surrounded by communist territory. Its survival depended on political will and international agreements. Despite this vulnerability, West Berlin became a symbol of freedom and resistance during the Cold War. The West German government invested heavily in the city. Economic incentives encouraged people to live and work there. Artists, students, and political activists were drawn by lower rents and a strong sense of independence. Unlike East Berlin, West Berlin developed a vibrant cultural scene. Music, art, and political debate flourished. Freedom of speech was taken seriously, often in deliberate contrast to the repression across the wall. Yet the wall was always present. It cut through neighborhoods, blocked streets, and cast shadows over daily life. Observation platforms allowed people to look into East Berlin, creating an unsettling sense of proximity without access. Families separated by the wall could sometimes see one another but rarely meet. The psychological weight of this separation never disappeared. West Berliners lived with the awareness that their city could become a battlefield if the Cold War turned hot. Military checkpoints, Allied soldiers, and periodic crises reminded everyone how fragile the situation was. Still, life continued. Cafes stayed open late. Universities expanded. The city developed a reputation for openness and experimentation. In many ways, West Berlin defined itself by what East Berlin was not. Freedom of movement, political choice, and cultural expression were not abstract ideas. They were daily realities defended by concrete and diplomacy. Perhaps the deepest wounds of the Berlin Wall were not political or economic, but personal. Families were torn apart overnight. Parents were separated from children. Siblings grew up on opposite sides of the wall. Weddings were missed. Funerals were unattended. Ordinary moments became impossible. For East Germans, contact with relatives in the West was heavily monitored. Letters were opened. Phone calls were recorded. Visits were rare and required special permission, often granted only to the elderly. The state feared that exposure to Western life would encourage dissatisfaction or escape attempts. West Germans faced their own frustration. They could see the wall, protest it, and condemn it, but they could not remove it. Many felt guilt for their relative freedom. Others grew angry or numb. Over time, a generation grew up that had never known a united Germany. Division became normal, even as it remained painful. Despite this, emotional connections endured. Families developed rituals to stay connected. They waved across the wall in early years. They sent carefully worded letters. They remembered birthdays and anniversaries in silence. These small acts of remembrance became quiet forms of resistance. The Berlin Wall was not only a border between political systems. It was a line drawn through human lives. Every year it stood made reunification feel more distant. Yet the shared history, language, and memory of unity never fully disappeared. Beneath the concrete and control, the idea of one Germany continued to survive. From the moment the Berlin Wall went up, it challenged something deeper than politics. It challenged the basic human desire to choose one's own life. For many East Germans, the wall was not just a barrier to the West. It was a statement that their government believed they needed to be trapped to remain loyal. That belief alone pushed countless people toward defiance. The reasons for escape varied. Some wanted political freedom and the right to speak openly. Others sought better economic opportunities or professional futures that were blocked by party loyalty requirements. Many simply wanted to reunite with family members on the other side. For younger generations, the wall represented stolen possibilities. The longer it stood, the more unbearable it felt. Attempting to escape was a serious crime. Failure could mean prison, loss of employment, and constant surveillance. Families of escapees often suffered retaliation. Despite this, people continued to plan, often in complete secrecy. Trust was dangerous. Even close friends could be informants. Every plan carried the risk of betrayal. What drove people forward was not ignorance of danger, but the belief that life without choice was not truly life at all. Some escapees described a point where fear became less powerful than despair. In those moments, the wall became something to be confronted rather than endured. Each attempt, successful or not, exposed the limits of control and reminded the regime that obedience could never be fully enforced. Over the years, escape attempts became more creative and more desperate. One of the most famous methods was tunneling. Groups of students and activists dug narrow passages under the wall, sometimes over many months. These tunnels were dark, unstable, and often flooded. Digging had to be done quietly and secretly, often from basements in West Berlin. Even successful tunnels were dangerous. Some collapsed. Others were discovered just days before completion. Hot air balloons became another remarkable method. In 1979, two families built a homemade balloon using fabric sewn in secret. They calculated wind patterns, fuel requirements, and weight limits with no margin for error. When they finally launched, they risked being shot down or crashing. Their successful escape captured global attention and embarrassed the East German authorities. Some people hid in modified cars, concealed in false compartments. Others swam across rivers or crossed frozen canals at night. A few even used zip lines or improvised flying devices. Each method revealed extraordinary ingenuity, but also the extremes people were willing to reach for freedom. Not all stories ended well. Many were caught. Some were killed. Each failure strengthened border defenses. Sensors were added. Guards were retrained. Technology improved. Yet escape attempts never fully stopped. The wall forced people into innovation, and innovation repeatedly challenged the wall. Beyond physical escapes, the wall became a site of psychological warfare. Border guards were often young men, many barely out of school. They were trained to see escapees as traitors and threats. At the same time, they lived under intense pressure. Failure to follow orders could result in punishment. Success in stopping escapes brought rewards and promotion. Some guards struggled deeply with their role. They faced unarmed civilians, sometimes families trying to cross. In rare cases, guards allowed people to escape or even fled themselves. Such incidents were harshly punished and carefully hidden by the state. On the western side, protests, art, and media coverage turned the wall into an international symbol of repression. Graffiti covered the western face of the wall, mocking the regime and celebrating freedom. Musicians and artists used the wall as a backdrop for performances that challenged division. East Germans could not officially see these acts, but rumors spread. The wall stood as a constant psychological presence. For those living near it, the sound of patrols, lights, and alarms became part of daily life. It reminded everyone that the Cold War was not abstract. It was built into streets, homes, and minds. Despite all this, the wall never fully achieved what it was meant to do. It stopped mass migration, but it could not create belief. It could enforce obedience, but not loyalty. Every escape, every protest, every whispered dream weakened the system holding it together. By the early 1960s, Berlin had become far more than a divided city. It was the most visible symbol of the Cold War itself. Every street near the wall, every checkpoint, and every military patrol carried global meaning. What happened in Berlin was watched closely by governments, journalists, and ordinary people around the world. It was a place where ideology was not debated in theory, but enforced with concrete, guns, and soldiers standing face to face. For the United States and its allies, West Berlin represented a moral commitment. Abandoning it would signal weakness and invite further Soviet expansion. For the Soviet Union and East Germany, the city was a constant challenge to their authority. The presence of a free, prosperous Western enclave inside communist territory exposed the contrast between the two systems more clearly than any speech or propaganda ever could. This tension made Berlin extremely dangerous. Any miscalculation could trigger a wider conflict. Tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie. Military aircraft tested airspace limits. Intelligence agencies operated constantly. Both sides understood that Berlin was a tripwire, a crisis that could escalate into a war neither side truly wanted, especially in a nuclear age. Yet neither side was willing to step back. The wall stabilized the situation by stopping migration, but it did not remove the underlying conflict. Instead, it froze it in place. Berlin became a stage where both sides performed strength, restraint, and resolve at the same time. The city lived under a constant shadow, knowing it mattered far beyond its size. World leaders understood the power of Berlin as a symbol. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin and delivered one of the most famous speeches of the Cold War. Standing before the wall, he declared solidarity with the people of the city and framed their struggle as the struggle of all free people. The message was simple and deliberate. The United States would not abandon Berlin. For West Berliners, the speech was deeply emotional. It reassured them that they were not alone. For East German leaders, it was infuriating. They saw it as provocation and propaganda. Yet even they understood that restraint was necessary. The wall itself was a compromise of sorts. It was brutal, but it avoided direct confrontation. The Soviet Union played a careful game. While it supported East Germany, it did not want a war over Berlin. Nuclear weapons changed everything. Any conflict between NATO and the Warsaw Pact carried the risk of total destruction. As a result, Berlin became a place where tension was managed rather than resolved. This era of careful balance defined the Cold War. Crises flared, then cooled. Leaders spoke loudly, but acted cautiously. Berlin remained divided, but stable. The wall stood firm, not because it was universally accepted, but because breaking it carried risks no one was willing to take. For ordinary people in Berlin, global strategy translated into daily anxiety. Air raid sirens, military convoys, and emergency drills were part of life. News of nuclear tests and international crises reminded everyone how quickly the situation could change. Children grew up knowing that their city was a potential target. At the same time, life had to go on. People worked, studied, fell in love, and built families under the shadow of possible annihilation. This created a unique mentality especially in West Berlin. There was a sense of urgency, of living intensely in the present. Cultural life flourished partly because tomorrow was never guaranteed. In East Berlin, the nuclear threat was used as justification for control. The state claimed that strict discipline was necessary to protect peace. Dissent was portrayed as dangerous and irresponsible. Fear of external enemies became a tool for internal repression. Despite all this, the absence of open war created a strange kind of endurance. The wall became permanent in practice, if not in spirit. People adapted to a divided world. The Cold War seemed endless, and Berlin appeared destined to remain its frozen center. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. Beneath the surface of stability, economic pressures, political dissatisfaction, and human longing continued to build. The wall was holding, but the forces pushing against it were growing stronger with each passing year. By the 1970s and 1980s, the East German state projected an image of stability and order, but beneath the surface the economy was struggling. Central planning had succeeded in providing basic needs, yet it proved inefficient at adapting to change. Factories met quotas on paper while producing outdated or low-quality goods. Innovation lagged behind the West, and productivity suffered. The gap between East and West Germany continued to widen in ways that were increasingly visible, even through the wall. The government invested heavily in heavy industry and military obligations, often at the expense of consumer needs. Everyday items like fresh produce, modern appliances, and reliable cars remained scarce. Waiting lists were long, repairs were constant, and improvisation became a way of life. People learned to fix, reuse, and adapt rather than replace. While this created resilience, it also reinforced frustration. To maintain the appearance of success, the state borrowed heavily from Western countries. These loans temporarily masked deeper problems, but created long-term dependency. As global economic conditions changed, East Germany found itself increasingly constrained. It could not compete internationally, yet it needed foreign currency to survive. The wall prevented people from leaving, but it could not prevent comparison. Western television signals reached most East German homes. Viewers saw well-stocked stores, modern lifestyles, and open discussion. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Over time, economic dissatisfaction became political dissatisfaction, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. Despite the reach of the Stasi, dissent never disappeared. It simply became quieter and more cautious. People learned to express dissatisfaction in private circles through humor, coded language, and cultural expression. Jokes about the government spread quickly. Satire became a safe way to share criticism without directly confronting authority. Churches played a particularly important role. In a state that restricted independent organization, churches provided rare spaces for discussion and community. While officially tolerated, they were closely monitored. Within church walls, people talked about peace, environmental issues, and social responsibility. These conversations gradually expanded into broader questions about rights and reform. Artists, writers, and musicians also pushed boundaries. Some faced censorship or travel bans, while others were allowed limited freedom as long as they avoided direct confrontation. Their work often carried layered meanings, understood clearly by audiences accustomed to reading between the lines. The Stasi adapted by expanding its surveillance network, but total control proved impossible. Monitoring everyone created its own weaknesses. Resources were stretched thin. Informants became unreliable. Fear worked, but it also produced resentment and exhaustion. Over time, obedience became more passive than loyal. By the 1980s, a new generation had grown up entirely behind the wall. They had no personal memory of a united Germany, yet many felt less committed to the system than their parents. The promises of socialism felt distant and unconvincing. Education emphasized ideology, but real life contradicted it daily. Young people compared their futures to what they saw on Western television. They wanted travel, opportunity, and choice. The state offered security, but little inspiration. Attempts to enforce loyalty through youth organizations often backfired, producing indifference rather than belief. At the same time, older generations who had endured war and hardship were growing tired. Many had accepted the system as the price of peace, but economic decline and lack of reform eroded that acceptance. Trust in leadership weakened, especially as corruption and privilege became more visible among party elites. These generational shifts mattered. They did not produce immediate revolution, but they changed the emotional foundation of the state. Fear alone could not sustain legitimacy forever. By the late 1980s, East Germany remained rigid while the world around it was changing. The system still stood, but it was increasingly hollow. The wall remained strong, yet the society it was meant to protect was slowly losing faith in itself. In 1985, a major shift began far from Berlin, in the heart of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, inheriting a system weighed down by economic stagnation, political rigidity, and declining global influence. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev believed that the Soviet system could not survive without deep reform. He was not trying to destroy socialism, but to save it from collapse. Gorbachev introduced two concepts that would transform the Eastern Bloc. The first was perestroika, meaning restructuring. It aimed to reform the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms and reducing inefficiency. The second was glasnost, meaning openness. It encouraged greater transparency, freer discussion, and limited criticism of the state. Together, these ideas loosened the tight grip that had defined communist rule for decades. Perhaps most important for Eastern Europe was Gorbachev's rejection of the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet military intervention to keep communist governments in power. Gorbachev signaled that each socialist country would be responsible for its own path. This shift sent shockwaves through the Eastern Bloc. For the first time since World War II, reform movements could imagine change without immediate Soviet tanks rolling in. In East Germany, the leadership reacted with fear rather than enthusiasm. Erich Honecker, who had ruled since 1971, rejected Gorbachev's reforms. He believed East Germany was already successful and saw openness as a threat to control. This refusal to adapt would prove disastrous. As the Soviet Union began to change, other Eastern European countries followed. In Poland, the Solidarity movement gained legitimacy and negotiated political reforms. In Hungary, leaders opened debate about economic and political restructuring. Censorship weakened. Borders softened. Step by step, the rigid order of the Cold War began to crack. East Germany watched these changes with growing anxiety. Its leaders insisted that reform was unnecessary and dangerous. Official media downplayed events elsewhere, but people noticed. Western television showed reforms unfolding across the Eastern Bloc. The contrast between movement elsewhere and stagnation at home became impossible to ignore. Hungary's decision to dismantle its border fence with Austria in 1989 had especially profound consequences. Although the border was not fully open at first, it created a symbolic breach in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans traveled to Hungary, hoping to escape to the west through this new opening. Others sought refuge in West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw. overwhelming diplomatic facilities, and creating international embarrassment. East Germany faced a crisis it could no longer hide. People were leaving in growing numbers, not through Berlin, but through the cracks opening across Eastern Europe. The wall still stood, but its purpose was being undermined from the outside. As pressure mounted, East German leaders grew increasingly isolated. Gorbachev visited East Berlin in October 1989 for the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic. During his visit, he warned indirectly that history punishes those who refuse to change. Crowds cheered him openly, a rare and dangerous display of public enthusiasm not directed at their own leaders. This moment revealed how fragile the regime had become. The leadership relied on force and fear, but it sensed that large-scale violence could backfire, especially without guaranteed Soviet support. The old rules no longer applied. At the same time, ordinary citizens were losing their fear. Peaceful demonstrations grew, particularly in cities like Leipzig. People gathered in churches and marched through streets carrying candles, chanting for reform, freedom to travel, and basic rights. The slogan, "We are the people," echoed through the streets, directly challenging the legitimacy of the state. The wall had survived tanks, escapes, and international crises. What it now faced was something different. A population that no longer believed in the system holding it up, and an international environment that would no longer guarantee its protection. The ground was shifting. Events were accelerating, and Berlin stood at the center of a moment that would change the world. By the fall of 1989, East Germany was no longer quietly dissatisfied. Discontent had moved out of private spaces and into the streets. What made this moment extraordinary was not just the size of the protests, but their character. These demonstrations were overwhelmingly peaceful. People carried candles instead of weapons. They marched in silence or sang hymns. Their power came from numbers and moral clarity rather than force. Leipzig became the heart of this movement. For years, Monday prayers for peace have been held at St. Nicholas Church. At first, they attracted only small groups. Over time, they became a gathering point for people who want to change. After the prayers, participants began to march through the city. Each week, the crowds grew. Tens of thousands of people demanded reform, freedom to travel, and basic rights. The state responded with intimidation. Police and security forces were deployed in large numbers. Hospitals prepared for casualties. Party leaders considered violent suppression, drawing on examples from earlier decades. But something had changed. The protesters did not back down. They knew violence was possible, yet they marched anyway. Fear began to shift sides. What made these protests especially dangerous for the regime was their visibility. Western media reported them widely. East Germans saw images of their fellow citizens standing together without being crushed. This broke the illusion that resistance was isolated or hopeless. Momentum built quickly. East Germany's leadership faced a crisis it was not prepared to handle. For decades, control had depended on predictability and fear. Now neither worked. Orders to suppress protests carried enormous risks. Violence could trigger mass unrest, international condemnation, and possibly the collapse of the regime itself. Yet allowing protests to continue openly weakened authority day by day. The Stasi had files, informants, and plans, but it did not have a solution. Surveillance could identify leaders, but this movement had none. It was decentralized, widespread, and rooted in ordinary citizens. Arresting a few organizers would not stop it. At the top, confusion reigned. Erich Honecker was removed from power in October 1989, replaced by Egon Krenz. The change was meant to signal reform, but it convinced few. Krenz had been part of the same system and lacked credibility. Promises of limited travel reforms and dialogue came too late and sounded hollow. Within the security forces, morale wavered. Soldiers and police were ordered to confront crowds that included friends, neighbors, and family members. Many questioned whether they would actually fire if told to do so. The regime still had weapons, but it no longer had certainty. As protests spread, the Berlin Wall itself became a growing problem for the East German state. It symbolized everything the protesters opposed. Calls for freedom of travel became central demands. The leadership understood that the wall was indefensible in moral terms, yet removing it seemed unimaginable. It was the foundation of the state's survival. Attempts to manage the situation through partial reforms only increased pressure. Travel restrictions were discussed, adjusted, delayed, and rewritten. Each announcement raised expectations and then disappointed them. People no longer trusted official statements. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Meanwhile, embassies remained crowded with East Germans seeking escape routes. The state looked powerless, unable to stop people from leaving or silence those who stayed. International attention intensified. The world was watching East Germany struggle to maintain control without violence. By early November 1989, the system was cracking visibly. Authority existed on paper, but not in practice. The wall still stood, but it was no longer supported by belief, fear, or confidence. It had become a liability rather than a solution. All that remained was a trigger, something small, perhaps even accidental, that would turn pressure into collapse. On November 9th, 1989, East Germany's leadership was under immense pressure. Protests were continuing, international scrutiny was intense, and the demand for freedom of travel could no longer be ignored. That afternoon, senior officials met to discuss new regulations that would slightly ease travel restrictions. The goal was to release pressure while keeping control. What they produced instead was confusion. Gunter Schabowski, a senior party official, was tasked with announcing the new travel rules at a press conference. He had not been deeply involved in drafting them and was poorly briefed. When journalists asked when the new regulations would take effect, Schabowski hesitated, flipped through his notes, and said the words that would echo around the world. As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay. Those words were not accurate. The plan was to introduce the rules later, with controls in place. But live television broadcasts carried Schabowski's statement across East and West Germany. Within minutes, news spread that the border was open. East Germans who had lived their entire lives under restriction heard something they had never expected to hear. Fullness rang across Berlin. People rushed into the streets. Word traveled faster than the authorities could react. Border guards were not informed of any changes. No orders had been given, yet crowds were forming, asking a simple question. If the border is open, why are the gates still closed? The state that had relied on precision and fear was undone by poor communication and hesitation. A system that once controlled every detail now found itself unable to control a single moment. As night fell, thousands of people gathered at Berlin's border crossings. The most famous was Bornholmer Strasse. Border guards faced an impossible situation. They had no clear instructions. Their radios were silent or unhelpful. They were trained to enforce the border, but they were now surrounded by peaceful crowds demanding passage. The guards asked for guidance from superiors. None came. The leadership feared giving an order that could trigger violence. The memory of protests, international pressure, and the absence of Soviet backing weighed heavily. Shooting into crowds was unthinkable. The people waited, chanted, and pressed forward. They were not angry. They were determined. Many carried identification papers, believing that somehow the system would recognize their right to pass. Others simply stood there, unwilling to leave. Shortly before midnight, the commander at Bornholmer Strasse made a decision on his own. He ordered the gates opened. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The barrier lifted and people began to cross. Guards stamped passports, then stopped stamping. The flow became uncontrollable. East Berliners crossed into West Berlin laughing, crying, hugging strangers. West Berliners ran toward them. Champagne bottles appeared. Church bells rang. A border that had defined global politics for nearly 3 decades vanished in a single night. That night, Berlin became something entirely new. People climbed onto the wall. They danced, sang, and chipped away pieces with hammers. The structure that once symbolized division turned into a platform for celebration. Guards who once enforced separation now stood aside, watching history unfold. Families reunited after decades apart. Parents met children who had grown up without them. Friends crossed streets they had avoided for years. No one had planned this moment, yet millions immediately understood its meaning. World leaders reacted with disbelief and caution. No one wanted to provoke instability. But for ordinary people, the meaning was clear. The wall was finished, even if parts of it still stood. What made the moment extraordinary was its peacefulness. No shots were fired. No orders were followed. The collapse came not through force, but through human movement, overwhelming an empty system of control. The Berlin Wall had fallen, not because it was torn down by governments, but because it no longer had the power to stop people from walking forward. The days following the fall of the Berlin Wall felt unreal to many Germans. The concrete still stood in long stretches, but its authority was gone. Border crossings remained open around the clock. East Germans crossed into West Berlin in numbers never seen before. Some went to shop, some to look, some simply to walk freely through streets they had only seen on television. West Berlin struggled to absorb the crowds, but the mood remained joyful. Strangers hugged. Cafes gave away food and drinks. Musicians played on street corners. The city felt like a festival, yet beneath the celebration was disbelief. People kept asking whether this could really last. For East Germans, the first encounters with the West were overwhelming. Supermarkets filled with unfamiliar products. Neon lights, advertisements, and abundance were exciting, but also disorienting. Many returned home the same night, unsure what freedom would mean for their future. The East German government announced new travel regulations, attempting to regain control over the situation. But control was already gone. The wall no longer functioned as a barrier. Crossing back and forth became normal within days. The fall of the wall stunned the world. Leaders in Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris reacted with cautious optimism. The Cold War order was shifting faster than anyone had predicted. While public reactions were celebratory, private discussions were filled with concern. For the United States, the event was a victory for democratic values, but also a test of restraint. Leaders avoided triumphal language that might humiliate the Soviet Union. Stability mattered more than celebration. In Moscow, Gorbachev faced mixed reactions. Many praised his refusal to use force. Others blamed him for losing control of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union itself was under growing strain, and the loss of East Germany's loyalty weakened its position. Western European leaders worried about the implications of German reunification. Memories of past wars lingered. A united Germany raised questions about power balances, alliances, and borders. The wall's fall reopened historical anxieties that had been frozen since 1945. The Cold War was not officially over, but one of its most powerful symbols had collapsed. The world was entering uncharted territory. Inside East Germany, the fall of the wall accelerated the collapse of the regime. The Socialist Unity Party lost credibility almost overnight. Its claim to legitimacy rested on control, and control had vanished. Demonstrations continued, now openly demanding free elections and systemic change. Stasi offices were occupied by citizens seeking to preserve files before they could be destroyed. The fear that had sustained the state dissolved rapidly. Economic reality also hit hard. East German industries were unprepared for open competition. The contrast between systems was no longer theoretical. It was visible in wages, technology, and opportunity. The wall's fall did not bring immediate clarity. It brought questions. Could East Germany reform itself? Would it merge with the West? What would happen to jobs, pensions, and identities built under socialism? What was clear was that there was no path back. The old order was finished. Germany, Europe, and the world were moving forward, even if no one yet knew where they would land. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germany entered a period of rapid and overwhelming change. The old system collapsed faster than anyone had expected. Ministries lost authority. Party officials resigned or disappeared from public life. Institutions that had once seemed permanent suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Ordinary citizens were no longer just observers of history. They were now participants in shaping what would come next. For many East Germans, the initial weeks after November 1989 were filled with both excitement and uncertainty. Freedom of movement was exhilarating, but it also exposed harsh realities. Factories were outdated. Infrastructure lagged behind. The economy, once protected by state planning, was now exposed to global competition. The question was no longer whether the old system could survive. It was what should replace it. Some hoped for a reformed, democratic East Germany that could preserve elements of social security while embracing political freedom. Others believed reunification with West Germany was the only realistic option. The West German model offered stability, prosperity, and immediate integration into Europe. As time passed, the pull of reunification grew stronger. Free elections were held in March 1990, the first truly democratic vote in East German history. The results were clear. Parties that supported rapid reunification won decisively. The people had spoken not through protest, but through ballots. The decision was emotional, practical, and historic. East Germany was no longer asking how to reform itself. It was asking how to become part of something larger. Reunification was not simply a German decision. It required international agreement. Germany's division had been created by World War II, and its reunification required the consent of the former Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Each had its own concerns. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl moved quickly. He understood that momentum mattered. Delay could bring uncertainty, resistance, or economic collapse. Kohl proposed a rapid path to unity, including economic and monetary union. His vision was bold and controversial, but it matched the mood of the moment. The Soviet Union faced the most difficult choice. Allowing reunification meant accepting a united Germany within NATO, something unthinkable just a few years earlier. Gorbachev ultimately agreed, influenced by economic necessity, diplomatic pressure, and his belief in peaceful change. The decision marked the true end of the post-war order in Europe. The 2+4 negotiations, involving the 2 German states and the 4 Allied powers, addressed borders, military limits, and sovereignty. They were complex and tense, but they succeeded. Germany regained full sovereignty, committed to peace, and confirmed its borders. Reunification was no longer a dream. It was a signed agreement, moving rapidly toward reality. On October 3rd, 1990, Germany officially became one country again. East Germany ceased to exist. its states joined the Federal Republic of Germany. Flags were raised. Fireworks lit the sky. The moment was emotional, symbolic, and historic. For many, it was the happiest day of their lives. Families who had lived under division for decades now belonged to the same country again. The wall, once a symbol of permanent separation, was now being dismantled piece by piece. Yet reunification was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a difficult transition. Economic inequality became immediately visible. Many East German factories closed. Unemployment rose sharply. Skills were undervalued. Identities shaped under socialism were questioned or dismissed. The joy of unity existed alongside disappointment and loss. Some felt like strangers in their own country. Others struggled to adapt to competition and uncertainty. Reunification delivered freedom, but it also demanded adjustment. Germany was whole again, but healing would take much longer than celebration. For many East Germans, reunification brought freedom overnight, but stability disappeared just as quickly. The transition from a planned economy to a market economy was abrupt and unforgiving. Entire industries that had operated for decades were suddenly deemed inefficient or uncompetitive. Factories closed. Millions lost their jobs within a short period of time. Skills that once guaranteed employment were no longer valued in the new system. The True Hand Agency, created to privatize East German state-owned enterprises, became one of the most controversial institutions of reunification. Its task was enormous: to restructure or sell thousands of companies in record time. Supporters argued it was necessary to modernize the economy. Critics argued it destroyed viable industries and favored Western investors. For ordinary workers, the result was the same. Uncertainty replaced security. This economic shock affected identity as much as income. Many East Germans had defined themselves through their work and social roles. Under socialism, employment was guaranteed and closely tied to personal dignity. Suddenly, people were competing for jobs, retraining in midlife, or facing long-term unemployment. Feelings of humiliation and invisibility spread. While freedom of speech, travel, and political participation were welcomed, they did not erase the pain of loss. For some, reunification felt less like a partnership and more like a takeover. The promise of unity was real, but its cost was unevenly distributed. Even after the physical wall disappeared, invisible divisions remained. West Germans and East Germans shared language and history, but decades of separation had shaped different experiences, habits, and expectations. These differences surfaced in workplaces, media, and everyday conversation. West Germans often assumed their system was clearly superior and expected rapid adjustment from their Eastern counterparts. East Germans, in turn, felt judged and misunderstood. Stereotypes emerged on both sides. East Germans were portrayed as dependent or unprepared. West Germans were seen as arrogant or dismissive. These attitudes deepened resentment. The term nostalgia, a nostalgic longing for aspects of life in East Germany, gained popularity. It did not mean a desire to return to dictatorship. Instead, it reflected a longing for social security, community, and recognition. People missed familiar brands, routines, and the sense of belonging that had been lost. Generational differences also mattered. Younger Germans adapted more easily, while older generations struggled with rapid change. For many families, reunification became a personal negotiation between past and future. The wall was gone, but unity required more than removing concrete. It required patience, empathy, and time. Despite challenges, reunification transformed Germany into a stronger democracy. East Germans gained rights that had once been unimaginable. Free elections, independent courts, and a free press became part of daily life. Civil society expanded. People organized, debated, and participated openly. At the same time, democracy faced tests. Disillusionment fueled political extremism in some regions. Economic inequality created frustration. Trust in institutions had to be rebuilt from scratch in the East. Germany responded gradually. Investment in infrastructure improved living standards. Education and mobility increased opportunities. Over time, differences narrowed, though they never fully disappeared. What mattered most was that change occurred peacefully. Germany did not descend into chaos or violence. The transition was painful, but it held. The fall of the wall had opened history. What followed was the slow, human work of turning freedom into everyday reality. After reunification, Germany faced a difficult question. What should be done with the Berlin Wall? For nearly 30 years, it had dominated the city and shaped millions of lives. Now that it no longer served a political purpose, it stood as a reminder of pain, repression, and separation. Some wanted it gone immediately, erased from the landscape as quickly as possible. Others argued that removing it entirely would risk forgetting what it represented. In the early 1990s, much of the wall was dismantled. Concrete slabs were removed, border installations torn down, and death strips redeveloped. Berlin needed space to heal and reconnect. Streets that had been cut off for decades were reopened. Neighborhoods were stitched back together. In many places, only subtle lines in the pavement marked where the wall had once stood. Yet complete erasure felt wrong to many. Survivors, former escapees, and families of victims insisted that memory mattered. Without visible reminders, future generations might fail to understand how extreme the division had been. The wall was not ancient history. It had shaped the lives of people who were still living. As a result, selected sections were preserved. These fragments became memorials, museums, and educational sites. They transformed the wall from an instrument of control into an object of reflection. What once enforced silence now invited conversation. Places like the Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Strasse were designed not just to display concrete, but to tell human stories. Visitors could see watchtowers, border installations, and preserve segments of the death strip. More importantly, they could read names, watch interviews, and learn about individual lives affected by the wall. These memorials emphasized that the wall was not an abstract structure. It was built, maintained, and enforced by people, and it affected people in deeply personal ways. Stories of escape attempts, family separations, and everyday fear were central. Victims were remembered not as statistics, but as individuals with hopes and futures cut short. Museums also played a role in addressing uncomfortable truths. They documented the role of informants, the reach of the Stasi, and the moral compromises ordinary people were forced to make. This was not easy history. It challenged simple narratives of heroes and villains. For many former East Germans, these spaces offered validation. Their experiences were finally recognized publicly. Their suffering was no longer denied or minimized. Memory became a form of justice, even when legal accountability was limited. As time passed, a new challenge emerged. Young Germans who had never seen the wall began to grow up. For them, division was something learned from textbooks rather than lived experience. Educators, historians, and families faced the task of making this history meaningful without turning it into distant myth. Schools incorporated personal testimonies, visits to memorial sites, and discussions about freedom and responsibility. The goal was not to create nostalgia or guilt, but understanding. The wall became a way to talk about democracy, human rights, and the dangers of unchecked power. Public debate continued about how to frame the past. Some worried that emphasizing repression alone ignored the everyday lives people built under socialism. Others feared that nostalgia could soften the reality of dictatorship. Germany navigated this tension by allowing complexity rather than enforcing a single narrative. Remembering the wall became an ongoing process, not a finished conclusion. It was less about preserving concrete and more about preserving awareness. The wall no longer divided the city, but its lessons continued to shape how Germans understood freedom, responsibility, and the cost of losing both. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked more than the reunification of a city or a nation. It signaled the collapse of a global order that had defined international politics for more than 40 years. The Cold War had structured alliances, justified military spending, and shaped everyday life across continents. When the wall fell, it became clear that the division of the world into two rigid camps was no longer sustainable. Within months, communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed or transformed. Czechoslovakia experienced the Velvet Revolution. Bulgaria and Romania saw dramatic political change. Poland and Hungary accelerated their reforms. None of this followed the old script of Soviet intervention. The absence of tanks mattered as much as the presence of protest. The wall's fall exposed how fragile the Cold War system had become. It was not destroyed by military defeat, but by loss of legitimacy. Citizens no longer accepted fear as the price of stability. Leaders no longer believed force would solve political problems. The ideological certainty that had sustained both sides faded quickly. For the United States and its allies, this was a moment of opportunity and responsibility. Victory narratives were tempting, but dangerous. Stability depended on cooperation, not humiliation. The wall's collapse demanded a new kind of leadership, one focused on integration rather than confrontation. The impact of the wall's fall on the Soviet Union was profound. Gorbachev's reforms had loosened control, but they had also unleashed forces he could not fully manage. Eastern Europe's transformation weakened the Soviet Union's strategic position and damaged confidence at home. Economic problems worsened. Nationalist movements gained strength. The Communist Party lost authority. The example of peaceful change in Germany and Eastern Europe inspired demands for reform across the Soviet republics. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. 15 independent states emerged. The Cold War ended not with a treaty, but with a quiet disintegration. The wall's fall was not the sole cause, but it was a powerful symbol and catalyst. The world entered a new era. Old certainties vanished. New challenges emerged, from regional conflicts to economic globalization. The promise of a peace dividend was real, but unevenly realized. In Europe, the end of division opened the door to integration. Former communist states sought membership in European and transatlantic institutions. The European Union expanded. NATO redefined its mission. Borders that had once been militarized became administrative. Germany played a central role in this transformation. Reunified and democratic, it became a stabilizing force rather than a threat. This shift was not automatic. It was built through trust, restraint, and commitment to cooperation. The fall of the Berlin Wall reshaped how Europeans understood themselves. Division gave way to shared challenges. History did not end, but it changed direction. The wall that once symbolized separation now stood as a reminder of how quickly systems can collapse when people stop believing in them. When the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified, history became intensely personal. Beyond treaties and political agreements, Millions of individuals faced reunification in their own lives. Families separated for decades suddenly had the chance to reconnect, but those reunions were often more complicated than imagined. Parents met adult children they barely knew. Siblings who had grown up under different systems struggled to understand each other's experiences. The joy of reunion was real, but it was often mixed with grief for lost time. Questions lingered about what might have been if the wall had never existed. Some families discovered painful truths. Files revealed that relatives had informed on one another, sometimes under pressure, sometimes willingly. These revelations tested bonds that had just been restored. Forgiveness was not automatic. For many, reconciliation became a long process rather than a single moment. Yet for all the pain, reunification allowed relationships to resume without fear. Grandparents watched grandchildren grow up without borders in between. Family gatherings became normal rather than exceptional. Ordinary moments, once impossible, regained their value. These personal reunions gave reunification its deepest meaning. They reminded Germany that unity was not an abstract idea, but a collection of human connections restored after decades of enforced separation. Reunification forced millions to redefine who they were. East German professionals found their qualifications questioned or dismissed. Teachers, engineers, doctors, and administrators often had to retrain or start over. For some, this felt like liberation. For others, it felt like erasure. The sudden exposure to competition challenged lifelong assumptions. Success was no longer guaranteed by state planning. Failure carried personal responsibility. This shift demanded emotional resilience as much as practical skill. Younger generations adapted more easily. They took advantage of new educational opportunities, travel, and global connections. Older workers often struggled, facing early retirement or long-term unemployment. Their sense of usefulness and dignity was tested. Despite hardship, reinvention became a defining theme. Many built new careers, started businesses, or pursued passions previously restricted. Freedom brought risk, but also possibility. Identity itself became a question. Were East Germans now simply Germans, or was something more complex? For many, the answer was both. They carried their past forward, shaping a new sense of self that acknowledged loss without being defined by it. As years passed, the intense emotions of reunification softened, but memory remained. Stories of life before 1989 were shared with children and grandchildren. Personal history became part of national history. Some chose to remember the past as a warning. Others remembered moments of solidarity, creativity, and endurance. Both perspectives mattered. They enriched understanding rather than simplifying it. Reunification did not erase differences overnight, but it allowed them to be discussed openly. Dialogue replaced silence. Memory replaced fear. The human stories of reunification revealed the true cost of division and the real value of freedom. They showed that walls do not only separate land, they separate lives, time, and possibility. When the wall fell, history moved forward, but it carried millions of personal histories with it. After 1989, the Berlin Wall quickly moved beyond its physical reality and became a global symbol. During the Cold War, it had represented a specific political divide between East and West. After its fall, it came to symbolize something broader: the human cost of ideological extremism, enforced division, and state control. Around the world, the image of people standing on the wall, waving flags and celebrating, became one of the defining visuals of the late 20th century. It joined a small group of historical images that seemed to capture an entire era in a single frame. The wall was no longer just German history. It became part of global memory, Politicians, activists, and educators began to reference the Berlin Wall when discussing other conflicts and divisions. It was used as a warning against building barriers, both physical and ideological. The message was clear and simple. Walls may enforce order for a time, but they rarely last. This symbolic power sometimes simplified history. The complexity of life on both sides of the wall, the compromises people made, and the gradual nature of change could be lost in favor of dramatic narratives. Still, the symbol endured because it was rooted in lived experience. The wall had been real, oppressive, and deeply personal for millions. As a symbol, the Berlin Wall came to stand not only for division, but for the possibility of peaceful change. Its fall showed that even seemingly permanent systems can collapse without violence when legitimacy disappears. Artists and musicians quickly responded to the fall of the wall. For decades, it had appeared in songs, novels, films, and paintings as a backdrop of tension and loss. After 1989, it became a subject of reflection and reinterpretation. Musicians held concerts near the former border. Painters turned wall fragments into canvases. Writers explored themes of memory, identity, and reunion. Films told stories of escape, surveillance, and ordinary life under division. These works helped international audiences understand the emotional reality behind political events. One of the most famous artistic transformations was the East Side Gallery in Berlin, where artists from around the world painted murals on preserved sections of the wall. What had once been a symbol of control became an open-air exhibition celebrating freedom, protest, and creativity. Popular culture also played a role in shaping memory. Movies and television often focused on dramatic escape stories or secret police intrigue. While these narratives sometimes exaggerated reality, they kept the history alive in public consciousness. Art did what official history sometimes could not. It captured ambiguity, pain, and contradiction. It allowed people to feel the past rather than simply learn it. As time passed, the Berlin Wall became a destination. Tourists from around the world visited memorials, museums, and remaining fragments. For Berlin, this created both opportunity and responsibility. Tourism helped preserve history and fund education, but it also risked trivializing suffering. Souvenirs made from wall fragments raised questions about commercialization. Could pain be packaged and sold without losing meaning? Germany responded by emphasizing education. Museums provided detailed context. Memorials focused on victims rather than spectacle. Schools integrated visits into curricula. The goal was not entertainment, but understanding. This careful approach reflected a broader commitment to historical responsibility. Remembering the wall was not about nostalgia or pride. It was about confronting the consequences of division honestly. The wall's presence in global memory remains powerful because it is grounded in truth. It reminds the world that freedom cannot be taken for granted, and that systems built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. The Berlin Wall stands as one of the clearest examples in modern history of how force can sustain a system without making it legitimate. For nearly 3 decades, the wall succeeded in one narrow sense. It stopped mass migration. It stabilized a state that might otherwise have collapsed much earlier. But it achieved this at a profound cost, both moral and human. The East German government relied on surveillance, intimidation, and physical barriers to maintain control. These tools were effective in preventing action, but they could not generate belief. People complied because they had to, not because they wanted to. Over time, this distinction mattered more than weapons or walls. The wall revealed that power rooted in fear is inherently fragile. It requires constant enforcement. It cannot tolerate openness or dissent. The moment fear weakens, control collapses quickly. This is exactly what happened in 1989. Once people realized that the state would not or could not use violence, the system unraveled with stunning speed. This lesson extends beyond Germany. It applies to any system that prioritizes control over consent. The wall did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it no longer served a purpose people were willing to accept. Another key lesson of the Berlin Wall is that freedom is rarely achieved alone. While individual escape attempts capture attention, lasting change came through collective action. Peaceful protests, shared courage, and public visibility mattered more than any single dramatic moment. The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig, the crowds at the border crossings, and the refusal of security forces to act violently all reflected collective choice. No single leader ordered the wall to fall. No revolutionary group seized power. Instead, ordinary people stepped forward together. This collective dimension protected the movement. It made violent repression riskier and less effective. It also ensured that change carried broad legitimacy. When the wall fell, it did so in front of the world, with millions watching and participating. Freedom, in this sense, was not a gift. It was a shared decision to stop accepting fear as normal. That choice required trust, patience, and restraint. It remains one of the most remarkable aspects of 1989. The final lesson of the Berlin Wall lies in how it is remembered. Memory is not passive. It shapes how societies understand power, injustice, and possibility. Forgetting the wall would risk repeating its logic under different names. Germany's commitment to remembrance reflects an understanding that democracy depends on awareness. Memorials, education, and public debate keep the past visible without glorifying it. This balance is difficult but necessary. The wall reminds us that freedom can disappear gradually and return suddenly. It shows how ordinary people adapt to restriction and how quickly they can reclaim agency when conditions change. Above all, it teaches that history is shaped not only by leaders and treaties, but by choices made under pressure. The Berlin Wall was built through decisions, maintained through obedience, and undone through courage. Its lessons remain relevant wherever power seeks permanence through division. Modern Berlin is a city that carries its past openly. Unlike cities that bury uncomfortable history, Berlin chose to rebuild while leaving traces visible. Streets once cut by concrete now flow freely, yet subtle markers in the pavement show where the wall once stood. These lines are quiet reminders that unity was earned, not inevitable. After reunification, Berlin faced enormous challenges. Government offices had to be relocated. Infrastructure needed massive investment. Neighborhoods that had developed separately for decades had to reconnect. Some areas flourished quickly. Others struggled with poverty, depopulation, or neglect. The process was uneven and often frustrating. East Berlin neighborhoods underwent rapid transformation. Old buildings were renovated. New businesses opened. Property values rose sharply. This brought opportunity, but also displacement. Longtime residents sometimes felt pushed aside by development they had not chosen. Once again, change came with mixed emotions. Yet Berlin embraced experimentation. Artists, entrepreneurs, and immigrants shaped a city known for openness and creativity. Its identity became less about being a capital of power and more about being a space of possibility. The physical wall was gone, but the city did not pretend it had never existed. Instead, Berlin integrated memory into daily life, allowing the past to inform, not dominate, the present. Decades after reunification, differences between East and West have narrowed, but not disappeared. Economic gaps persist. Wages and wealth remain lower on average in former East German regions. Political attitudes also differ, shaped by distinct historical experiences. These differences are not failures. They are evidence of how deeply systems shape lives over time. A society does not reset overnight. It carries habits, expectations, and wounds forward. Berlin reflects this complexity. Some neighborhoods feel seamlessly integrated. Others still show traces of separation in architecture, infrastructure, and social networks. Residents are aware of these distinctions, but they are less divisive than before. Younger generations, in particular, experience Berlin as a single city. Their identities are shaped more by global culture than Cold War history. For them, the wall is something to learn about, not live with. This generational shift does not erase the past, but it changes its role. Memory becomes a foundation rather than a barrier. Berlin's transformation offers lessons to the world. It shows that divided cities can heal without erasing history. It demonstrates that reconciliation is not a moment, but a process measured in decades. At the same time, Berlin remains cautious. Its leaders and citizens know how fragile freedom can be. Political extremism, economic inequality, and social tension still exist. The city's past makes it sensitive to signs of exclusion and authoritarianism. Berlin's strength lies in its willingness to confront discomfort. Museums, memorials, and public debate ensure that history remains part of civic life. This openness is not about guilt. It is about responsibility. Today, Berlin stands not as a monument to victory, but as a reminder of resilience. It shows that walls can fall, but the work of unity never truly ends. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 stands as one of the defining turning points of modern history. It marked the end of an era shaped by rigid blocks, nuclear standoffs, and ideological certainty. For more than 4 decades, the Cold War had structured global politics. Alliances were fixed. Conflicts were interpreted through a single lens. The wall embodied that frozen world. When it fell, it did not simply remove a barrier. It disrupted assumptions that had governed international relations since World War II. The idea that the world was permanently divided into hostile camps suddenly looked outdated. Change, once feared as destabilizing, became possible without war. What made 1989 unique was not just what happened, but how it happened. No armies advanced. No governments collapsed overnight through violence. Instead, legitimacy drained away. Citizens demanded change, and leaders hesitated to stop them. This challenged long-held beliefs about how power operates. The wall's fall also changed how history itself was understood. It reminded the world that systems that appear permanent can dissolve quickly. It encouraged historians and policymakers alike to take popular legitimacy more seriously. Stability without consent was exposed as fragile. In this sense, 1989 was not the end of history, but the end of a particular way of imagining it. The events of 1989 inspired hope far beyond Germany. People around the world saw the fall of the wall as proof that peaceful change was possible. Activists referenced it in struggles against authoritarianism. The image of crowds crossing borders freely became a universal symbol of liberation. Yet the lessons of 1989 were often simplified. Some interpreted it as a final victory of one system over another, rather than a collapse driven by internal failure and popular pressure. This misunderstanding led to unrealistic expectations about how easily other societies could transform. The post-Cold War world brought new challenges. Ethnic conflicts, economic inequality, and political instability did not disappear. In some places, the absence of old structures created power vacuums rather than freedom. The optimism of 1989 met the complexity of reality. Still, the wall's fall remained relevant. It showed that nonviolent movements could succeed. It demonstrated the importance of international restraint. And it highlighted how quickly events can accelerate once fear breaks down. History did not repeat itself neatly, but it echoed. Decades after 1989, the Berlin Wall continues to matter because the world remains divided in new ways. Physical walls still exist. So do ideological, economic, and digital barriers. The temptation to separate, exclude, and control has not disappeared. In this context, the wall's history offers perspective. It shows that walls can enforce order temporarily, but they rarely address underlying problems. They often deepen resentment and delay change rather than preventing it. The fall of the Berlin Wall reminds us that openness carries risk, but closure carries stagnation. It challenges societies to consider whether security achieved through division is truly secure. 1989 matters because it was a moment when history bent toward possibility. Not certainty, not perfection, but possibility. That distinction remains important. The wall no longer stands, but the questions it raised are still with us. The fall of the Berlin Wall is often remembered as a single night filled with celebration, tears, and disbelief. People climbing concrete, hugging strangers, and crossing borders that had once been deadly. But reducing it to a moment risks missing its deeper meaning. The wall did not fall suddenly. It collapsed under the accumulated weight of decades of human pressure. Every restricted conversation, every denied travel request, every whispered complaint contributed to its eventual failure. The wall stood for 28 years not because it was strong, but because fear was stronger. When fear weakened, the wall had nothing left to support it. This perspective matters because it reminds us that history is rarely shaped by dramatic events alone. It is shaped by long periods of endurance followed by moments of clarity. The night of November 9th, 1989 was one such moment, but it was built on countless unseen choices made by ordinary people over many years. The wall's end was not a victory of one nation over another. It was a victory of human agency over enforced division. That distinction gives the event its lasting power. The Berlin Wall caused undeniable suffering. Lives were lost. Families were divided. Opportunities disappeared. Trauma lingered long after reunification. Acknowledging this cost is essential. History should never soften the consequences of repression in the name of celebration. At the same time, the wall's fall revealed something equally important. People are capable of reclaiming their future without violence when conditions allow. The peaceful nature of 1989 was not accidental. It reflected restraint, courage, and collective responsibility. Reunification did not erase hardship, but it restored choice. And choice is the foundation of dignity. The ability to decide where to live, what to say, and how to shape one's life changed everything, even when outcomes were uncertain. The human gain of 1989 was not perfection. It was possibility. That possibility reshaped millions of lives and altered the direction of history. The Berlin Wall no longer divides Berlin, but its message continues to matter. It warns against systems that rely on separation to survive. It challenges the belief that stability can be built on fear. And it reminds us that legitimacy cannot be enforced forever. The wall also carries hope. It shows that even the most solid structures can fall when people stop believing in them. It demonstrates that peaceful change is possible, even under conditions that appear immovable. History did not end with the wall's fall. New challenges emerged. New divisions formed. But the lesson of 1989 remains relevant. Walls may shape lives for a time, but they cannot define humanity. The Berlin Wall fell because people chose to walk forward together. That choice, repeated across generations and contexts, is what continues to shape the world. Today, you heard the full journey of the Berlin Wall. How it was born from fear after World War II. How it was built overnight to trap a population. How it stood for decades as a symbol of control, surveillance, and division. And how, in 1989, it collapsed not because of war, but because people stopped believing in it. You heard about families torn apart and reunited, about lives lost trying to escape, about peaceful protests that prove courage does not always need weapons, and about reunification, which brought freedom, but also pain, adjustment, and long healing. The moral of this story is simple, but powerful. Walls can control bodies, but they cannot control belief forever. Fear can silence people for years, but not for a lifetime. And systems built without consent eventually collapse under their own weight. The Berlin Wall reminds us that history is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but by ordinary people who choose courage over silence. If this story made you think, if it made you feel, and if it made you see history differently, then this journey was worth it. This is History Teller YT, where history is not just told, it is felt. Stay curious, stay aware, and join us again, because there are many more untold stories waiting to be heard. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more.